Hi guys, Brexiteers are starting to panic. And when they panic, they ramp up the fearmongering. So the same people who told us that Donald Trump winning in 2016 will be great for Britain repeated that line in 2020, although he lost, and again in 2024, well, those people are starting to look a bit stupid. When Trump imposed 20% tariffs on the EU and 10% on the UK, they claimed that they had found a Brexit benefit, but that lasted about a week. Now that it's becoming less and less likely that the UK can convince the Trump administration to treat it with any sort of dignity, the Starmer government is becoming more open about improving relations with the EU, which is causing people like Jacob Rees-Mogg to brick it.
Starmer of the second referendum, who always hated Brexit, is now trying to rejoin by stealth. This time, the Labour government is seeking to restore regulatory alignment with the EU while accepting subservience to the highly political European Court of Justice as it seeks to continue the UK's role as the main subsidy payer of European farmers. Accepting jurisdiction of the ECJ would mean that we would be going back inside the EU effectively, but perhaps worse, giving rule-making powers to foreigners and making prices higher for UK consumers.
Okay, I'm not sure how it would increase prices, but Jacob Rees-Mogg is actually making an argument here for the UK to rejoin the European Union. Because he's saying here, look, if we have closer alignment with the EU and we have to accept the rulings of the ECJ, we will be a rule taker. Now, the UK, of course, at the moment is a rule taker, because if it wants to sell goods into the single market, it has to follow the rules. But he's making an argument here for rejoining the European Union, because he's saying, look, we don't want to be a rule taker. We want to be a rule maker. The only way to be a rule maker is to rejoin the European Union.
This was one of the Conservative government's red lines while negotiating Brexit, that it would never accept the jurisdiction of the ECJ, although it has to be said, Rishi Sunak then sold out Northern Ireland in the Windsor framework.
Sold out Northern Ireland. Jacob Rees-Mogg was one of those people who kept saying, we don't need to worry about Northern Ireland. We'll sort out Northern Ireland at some other stage. Don't worry, we'll have an electronic border. I would love to interview Jacob Rees-Mogg and ask him about the progress in the technology on electronic borders. Remember, this is back in 2017, 2018. He was talking about having an electronic border. You know, one that can scan trucks to determine whether the milk is suitable for export or import. Can scan a truck to see if there are people smuggled on board. Oh, God.
This revelation follows proposals being discussed ahead of the first UK-EU summit set to take place in London in May, setting a new future for our post-Brexit relationship. This move would suggest an effort from the government to surrender our regulatory freedoms along with our fish to the EU, even though it could have a detrimental effect on negotiations with the US.
What negotiations? So we keep hearing about negotiations with the US. How are those negotiations progressing? I keep saying, if you want to have a trade deal with the US, it must be on services only. Because if you negotiate on products, you're going to have to accept US products into the UK. Hormone-treated beef, chlorinated chicken. There is no demand for that in the United Kingdom, but it also creates another problem, as I've mentioned before. If you want to sell goods into Northern Ireland, this will increase the checks, because the EU blocks chlorinated chicken and hormone-treated beef. You know, Jacob Rees-Mogg here is talking about Northern Ireland. If he got his way, Northern Ireland would be in a worse position, because there would be more checks in place, because you'd have to carry out more checks, because you're importing stuff from the US, which is banned currently in the EU.
Any move to regulatory alignment would damage Britain's ability to negotiate trade deals with other nations that do not follow EU processes, including the United States. Simplistically, in terms of regulation, the US has outcome standards. Is the product safe? While the EU has process standards. Has the method of production been followed? Adjusted for differences in reporting, this leads to similar food safety standard outcomes. And this is despite the Reverend Starmer's position that Britain doesn't need to pick sides between the special relationship between both the US and the EU. So why should we be following EU regulations on food when we're their biggest customer? They sell us more than 3 times what we buy from them. Why are we subsidising the French, the Irish and Dutch farmers at the cost of you, ladies and gentlemen, the British consumer? During the election campaign, Labour said it wouldn't try to reverse Brexit, but it now seems that's exactly what the government is trying to do.
He's trying to sell this idea that because the UK imports stuff, it's subsidising other countries. Just let that marinate in. This is the same sort of rhetoric we're hearing from Donald Trump. Donald Trump is saying, we import a lot of stuff from China, so we're propping up China. We import a lot of stuff from Canada, so we're propping up Canada. No! Look, I don't believe that Jacob Rees-Mogg is that stupid. I think he's quite an intelligent individual. He's stupid when it comes to certain things, but I don't think he's that stupid. I think he understands how trade operates. What he does is he pretends not to understand. When he was business secretary, he pretended not to understand the consequences of Brexit because he is aligned to it. He has invested so much in it, politically and economically. But to suggest that, well, because the UK imports a lot from Ireland or from France or whatever, this is a problem. This needs to be eliminated. The UK during winter imports 40% of its food. Now, Jacob Rees-Mogg would be of the idea, well, we need to stop that, we need to produce it all ourselves. But at the same time, we don't want to bring in the workers necessary to work in the fields. So how would you achieve the goal of complete independence? I don't think it's actually possible, and it doesn't make economic sense. Or, I know some Brexiteers want to turn the UK into the North Korea of Europe, but how would you achieve your goal while at the same time complaining about foreigners coming in to do the work?
Reattaching the shackles to the body politic, which would only make British consumers poorer and British businesses more regulated.
This is the same guy who told people, vote for Brexit and prices will go down. Vote for Brexit and you will have cheaper food. You will have cheaper shoes. Now, how is that working out? Obviously, things are more expensive because of Brexit. Because if you have to import so much stuff, it's more expensive post-Brexit because more checks have to be carried out. As we saw last year, I believe, European producers, for example, when it came to tomatoes, could have been the year before, European producers, when it came to tomatoes, were prioritizing European customers over the UK because it's easier to trade within the EU. So it was more expensive to send goods to the UK because the checks create delays. And if you want to continue to sell goods, you need to increase the quantity. Because a certain amount of those goods, because they're perishable, will rot. So you have to take a loss there. Remember, this is the guy who said food would be cheaper. Now he's saying, well, if we join the EU, it would be more expensive.
For example, we would not have been able to pass emergency legislation to save British steel as fast as we did, as it would have needed EU state aid approval. It's worth reminding ourselves of the absurd...
What the hell is he talking about here? We would not be able to save... There's nothing here about saving British steel. Isn't it ironic that it's in Italy, in France, in Germany, we don't have these problems when it comes to steel production? The governments have a role in that. The UK decided. There's so much to talk about here. This is from a guy who supported a party and was a member of the party who supported privatization. The problem with steel is not the European Union. It's privatization, something that you continue to support. And now he's trying to offload the responsibility of that onto the EU. It's beyond absurd. So he's desperate. He's worried. He's afraid. And he's speaking to the converted. He's preaching to the choir here. Because who is actually still on board with the idea that Brexit was a good idea, apart from Jacob Rees-Mogg and a few crazy people? Because the public have moved on. The public realize it was a mistake. They were promised lower immigration. They were promised lower prices. They were promised wonderful trade deals with countries around the world. They got some trade deals that were not so wonderful. They were told that they would be at the front of the queue when it came to a trade deal with the United States, even though Obama said the opposite, and we're still waiting for a trade deal. Jacob Rees-Mogg himself said a few years ago the benefits of Brexit would arrive in about 50 years. But he's still selling the idea that they will arrive.